In 2025, relations between Kyiv and Washington developed amid a constant search for ways to end Russia's war against Ukraine. Summits, negotiations, and intensive consultations at various levels. Reaching agreements was not easy. Nevertheless, the dialogue between Ukraine and the United States persisted and remained one of the key factors in the peace process. Ending the war in Ukraine within 24 hours became one of Donald Trump's main promises during his election campaign. However, in January, after the inauguration, the U.S. president stated that it was just a figure of speech. He said that nothing can be resolved in a day, but 3 months would be more than enough. Trump tasked his Special Representative Keith Kellogg with developing a plan and securing the signing of a peace agreement within 100 days. In short, the document called on NATO to hold off on admitting Ukraine into the alliance and offered Russia a relaxation of sanctions in exchange for signing a peace agreement. However, all of this remained only on paper. Moscow showed no interest in cooperating with Kellogg. After that, Trump stopped announcing any deadlines regarding the end of Russia's war against Ukraine, and by the end of the year, admitted that the problem turned out to be much more serious than he had expected. Negotiations are ongoing. I hope we can bring this to a close. We stopped 8 wars, and I thought this conflict would be somewhere in the middle of my list. At first, I thought it would be simple, maybe even relatively easy, but it's very difficult. The first meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and the newly elected U.S. president took place on February 28th in the Oval Office of the White House. The conversation was tense, and in fact, not a single important issue was resolved at that time. 2 months later, the leaders met again at the Vatican during the farewell ceremony for Pope Francis. In St. Peter's Basilica, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky had a one-on-one conversation, and it turned out to be constructive. In April, the U.S. State Department authorized the export of defense products to Ukraine worth over $50 million through direct commercial contracts, and also approved the potential sale of equipment for F-16s to Kyiv.
With President Trump, I believe we had the best dialogue of all the ones we've had before. Maybe it wasn't very long, but it was the most substantive. With all due respect to our teams, I think the one-on-one format worked. We had the right atmosphere for the conversation itself. I'm sure that after our meeting in the Vatican, President Trump started to see things a little differently. Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, at a meeting with journalists.
Around the same time, at the initiative of the United States, 2 rounds of negotiations took place in Saudi Arabia. The Americans first met with the Russian delegation and then with the Ukrainian one. And already in May, direct dialogue between Kyiv and Moscow began in Istanbul. In total, 3 negotiation sessions were held within this framework, but the only agreement reached was on a prisoner exchange. The Kremlin delegates repeated their grievances and accusations, issuing ultimatums. And they delved into pseudo-historical digressions. However, they were not actually interested in achieving results. At that time, American media expressed the opinion that Putin was dangerously close to burning the Golden Bridge that had been built for him by Trump. The Kremlin never agreed to the 30-day ceasefire that the U.S. was pushing for and that Ukraine supported. And here's what the reputable publication The Washington Post wrote during that period.
After 6 months of White House skepticism toward Kyiv and friendliness toward Moscow, President Donald Trump and leading Republicans changed course. Now the White House is preparing to send additional weapons to Ukraine, and Congress is moving to impose new, tough sanctions against Russia. The shift in positions this week came amid growing frustration from Trump over Putin's unwillingness to seriously discuss ending the war against Ukraine. From the Washington Post publication,
July 2025, the U.S. and NATO launched a new mechanism to support Ukraine, Pearl, which became a practical continuation of the security agreements. Under this scheme, European NATO countries and Canada fund the supply of American weapons and equipment based on Kyiv's priority requests. From August to October 2025 alone, more than $2 billion was allocated through Pearl for the purchase of missiles for air defense systems, Patriot, ammunition for HIMARS, and other key American weaponry. In October, the U.S. Department of the Treasury imposed sanctions on Russia's largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, as well as their subsidiaries. This also became a significant form of support for Kyiv. After all, these very companies accounted for up to 40% of the oil revenues in the budget of the aggressor country. As economists vividly put it, this was not just a slap in the face to the Kremlin, but a powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
The new sanctions imposed by the U.S. Department of the Treasury in October against Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, increased the pressure on Russia's budget and energy sector. Moscow is forced to agree to increasingly large price discounts, exceeding $20 per barrel. As a result, the price of Russian Urals crude oil has dropped to $35 per barrel, which is significantly lower than the $69 per barrel originally budgeted by Russia for 2025. From a publication by The Washington Post.
On November 18th, the Axios portal reported on a new peace plan project by President Trump to end Russia's war against Ukraine. And already in the evening of November 19th, an American delegation led by U.S. Secretary of the Army Dan Driscoll arrived in Kyiv. Next came Ukrainian-American negotiations in Geneva and Florida, followed by a series of meetings in London and Berlin, this time also involving European leaders. The updated document was shortened from 28 to 20 points, and no more deadlines were set for Ukraine. Washington and Brussels pledged to provide Kyiv with reliable security guarantees that could protect the country for decades. The main function of control and deterrence is assigned to the United States. In addition, the U.S. will help identify provocations and false flag operations to prevent escalation and avoid a resumption of war. At the same time, there remains strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in the U.S. Congress. Senators are convinced that any peace plan is doomed to fail if it's based on appeasing the aggressor. This could lead to even more dire consequences, both for Ukraine and for all of Europe.
If the U.S. and its allies want to resolve the conflict through negotiations, the only proven and viable way is to strengthen Ukraine's position, not weaken it. Abandoning Ukraine, or giving Russia what it cannot achieve on the battlefield, will not bring lasting peace. Putin wants more than just Donbass. He completely denies Ukraine's sovereignty, and his ambitions extend to the Baltics and other countries that were once held captive by the Soviet Empire. Jeanne Shaheen, Democratic senator, and Mitch McConnell, Republican senator, in an op-ed for The Washington Post.
The year 2025 made it clear Ukraine has always supported U.S. peace initiatives and was ready for negotiations, provided its national interests were taken into account. Meanwhile, the Kremlin offered nothing but blackmail and threats. A drawn-out peace process, or rather an imitation of one, instead of actually stopping the war, that's the tactic the Kremlin chose. Fear and blood, that's what the Putin regime's power vertical is built on. That's why continued U.S. support for Ukraine next year isn't just a matter of politics, it's the key to real peace and security in Europe.